the Arkansas senator joins us right now. Senator Cotton, it's just such an honor and pleasure for you to be here. What needs to happen so the United States of America prevents this from ever happening again?
Well, good evening, Dagan and Sean. Thanks for having me on. Look, it was clear from the very earliest days of this pandemic that this virus almost certainly originated in that lab in Wuhan, not in some food market that didn't sell bats in an area where bats are not present. What's disappointing is that the Biden administration and liberals in the media continue to this day to apologize for China, to defend them, almost act as their lawyer, trying to bend over backwards, not to put the blame for all the harms of this pandemic where it belongs, on Chinese communists. Millions of lives lost, millions of businesses and jobs lost as well. Until we can actually say in public, without fear of accusations of racism or xenophobia or conspiracy theorizing, that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this pandemic, we can't start to take the steps that are necessary to make China pay. Things that we should have done a long time ago, to be honest, like banning TikTok from the United States, banning Chinese nationals from owning farmland here, kicking out diplomats who are really spies, revoking their most favored nation status. It's critical that the American people get those steps to make Chinese communists accountable for the harm they inflicted on our country and really all around the civilized world.
Senator, from your time in the House to now in the Senate, you've been one who's called out the risks and the threats of China. What do you think we can get out of the select panel on China? Is there some legislation, some awareness that comes from these hearings that are going to happen and starting tonight?
Well, I want to commend Speaker McCarthy for creating the panel, and Chairman Mike Gallagher is going to be a strong leader of this panel. So far, it looks like they've had bipartisan support, and that's gratifying because Chinese communists are not threatening Republicans or Democrats, they're threatening Americans. And I hope that we get the full exposure of the full range of malign activities in which China has engaged, from stealing our factories, our entire industry, stealing intellectual property, using students on campuses for espionage, the whole extent of the China lobby in Washington. I think those kind of public hearings can galvanize public opinion that breaks through in Washington, where some leaders still don't fully appreciate the threat that China poses to our very way of life.
Senator, I have long conversations with people about this in business all the time. And if the American people really knew that, because we talk about multinational corporations, like our social media companies, our technology companies, they can't do business in China. Say video game companies, but Chinese companies can do business here easily and readily. And we import an increasing number of imports, goods far and wide with abandon. One of the top video games is a video game made by a Chinese company. And there needs to be essentially a ban on Chinese companies doing business here.
Yeah, Dagan, I would say one basic principle that we should apply in all of our dealings with Chinese communists is reciprocity.
Right.
Whatever they do to us, we should do to them. So if they want to ban companies like Twitter or Facebook from doing business in China, we should ban TikTok from doing business here. If they don't allow American diplomats to get more than a few miles beyond our embassy in Beijing or our consulates around the country, we should do the same thing here. Do you think you can go to China and buy farmland around sensitive military sites? I don't think so. We shouldn't allow it here in America. Basic reciprocity, I suspect, would strike most Americans as basic common sense.
Yeah, that's pretty common sense, and I wish more people had that common sense, Senator. But I'm going to switch gears on you because since China won't change their behavior, Dr. Deborah Burke says she's worried about the next time. Watch this.
And I worry that we haven't put the new things in place that will keep us and protect us from the next pandemic.
The problem is that we're still paying for this type of research, and the White House continues to back it.
Yeah, as I said, the White House is bending itself into pretzels trying to defend Chinese communists. It's very similar to what they did with the spy balloon earlier this month, Sean. Speculating that maybe a wind blew it off course from Guam to Alaska. That must have been one heck of a wind to get that balloon from Guam to Alaska. They're doing the same thing now, continuing to insist there's no consensus in our intelligence agencies. Well, I can tell you there's frequently not consensus in our intelligence agencies. There's frequently not conclusive proof. That's why you have to use the facts in front of you and your basic common sense and judgment, most Americans know that this virus almost certainly came from those labs, and those labs are continuing to conduct dangerous research, and they still don't live up to American or European safety standards, and that is a genuine risk not only to America but to the world.
Senator, will the White House declassify all of this information, all the evidence related to this lab leak theory? Under Senator Mike Braun, this is back in 2021, the Senate passed a bill to do that very thing. Is that going to happen?
Well, I think the White House should, consistent with protecting our sources and our methods of intelligence collection. I know Chairman Gallagher on the China Select Committee in the House has proposed that as well.
Right.
I can tell you, though, I have reviewed this intelligence for a long time. It is still basically what meets the eye. Every fact, every piece of evidence, circumstantial, because China has destroyed, I think, most of the direct evidence, points to those labs. They don't point to a food market. And that's the basic common sense that most Americans see, whether or not the Biden administration ever declassifies any intelligence.
No doubt about that. President Biden was speaking today in Virginia Beach. He's stepping up the war with MAGA Republicans, MAGA. He's claiming that they will add $3 trillion more to the deficit with tax cuts for the rich and plan to slash Medicaid and Medicare for seniors. Senator, what's your response? I mean, this is the guy that spent $5 trillion above our standard spending in 2 years of his presidency, and he's saying that you, Tom Cotton, and Republicans are going to spend $3 trillion more. What do you say?
Well, first, it's obvious, Sean, that we have a spending problem,
Yes.
not a revenue problem.
Yes.
Even with the tax cuts that we passed in 2017, even with a global pandemic in 2020, tax revenues to the federal government are as high as they've ever been. Our problem is that spending is a lot higher, in no small part because Joe Biden and the Democrats spent the last 2 years on a drunken spending binge, as if they were drunken sailors on shore leave, although frankly that's probably an insult to drunken sailors. We have a spending problem in Washington that's driven by President Biden and the Democrats. Second, on health care, Joe Biden is the one that's cutting Medicare right now as we speak. Tens of thousands of Arkansans use Medicare Advantage, and they're deeply satisfied with that. Yet Joe Biden's administration is cutting payments to Medicare Advantage because they don't like senior citizens getting their health insurance through private insurance carriers in the Medicare Advantage program. They want them into a one-size-fits-all program. Sean, it's a lot like what we saw when we served in the House together, cutting Medicare to pay for Obamacare. That's exactly the kind of cuts that Joe Biden has proposed again.
And Senator, I don't think we say it enough that revenue actually went up. We reduced taxes, stimulated the economy. There was more economic growth, and revenue to the federal coffers actually increased. It didn't go down, contrary to what Joe Biden says. And I don't think we say that enough.
Well, this
We don't.
This $3 trillion that President Biden keeps bringing up, they came up with that number because that would come from extending the Trump tax cuts. Who benefited from the Trump tax cuts? Most American households. The vast majority of American households got a tax cut under that tax package. So President Biden is trying to lay that at the Republicans' feet. So he's saying, oh, the debt's going to go up by $3 trillion. So what is he saying? That he wants to raise taxes on most American households? That's what it's a self-owned, Senator, and he doesn't realize it.
No, and Dagan, as Sean pointed out too, is those tax cuts that didn't just put more money into the pockets of working Americans through things like raising brackets on the lower end of the income ladder, or increasing the standard deduction so people can have a larger deduction without paying for the services of a tax preparer or an accountant. They also increase revenue to the federal government, and that is something that constantly happens throughout the history of our tax code going back 100 years. When you reduce tax rates, in the long run you increase tax revenue because it generates more economic activity.
And just we got to go in a second, but to the point of the lie that Dagan just brought out, I don't know if you were in the House yet, but when the Bush tax cuts were about to expire, it was in my early part of my tenure. I think you were there about the same time, but when the Bush tax cuts passed, they were like, these are just tax breaks for the rich. But when they were about to expire, liberals were losing their mind on the House floor, saying, "Oh no, all these middle-income Americans are going to pay more in taxes." They totally flipped the script when the tax cuts were going to go away because they were for middle-income Americans. The same thing here with the tax cuts from 2017 with Donald Trump when you were in the Senate and I was in the House. The tax cuts were driven towards middle-income, low-income Americans, and that's where the heart of that tax policy came from.
Right.
Final word, Senator?
And that's why Democrats in the end always go to the middle class to raise taxes, because that's where the money is. That's where you have the most Americans working hard, trying to make ends meet, and there's no way that liberals can get enough tax rate increases off of rich people to fund all of their pie-in-the-sky big government schemes. They have to raise taxes on the middle class and working class. Again, that's what they do time and time again.
Senator, great to see you. Senator Tom Cotton.
Thank you.